Your phone dies tonight. Everything on it is gone. Photos, numbers, notes, everything. You'd feel sick for about a day. Then you'd rebuild it. Cloud backup, screenshots, someone resends the photos. Now take that away. No cloud, no copies, no writing of any kind. Nothing your family knows exists anywhere except inside 2 or 3 human skulls. Where the water is when the river dries. Which berries kill you in autumn but not in spring? What your people did the last time the herds didn't come. Those skulls belong to the oldest people around that fire. They can't run, they can't hunt, they can't carry anything. And they are the single most valuable thing that band of ancient humans owns. Because when they die, the file doesn't get corrupted. It gets deleted. And we know exactly what that looks like, because it happened to real people in recorded history. In the 1820s, a sickness moved through a small group of Inuit in northern Greenland. It killed the old people first. Within 1 generation, the survivors forgot how to build a kayak. Read that again. People living on an Arctic coast forgot how to make a boat. They forgot the bow. They forgot the fish spear. They forgot the design that kept the heat inside their own houses. And nobody rebuilt it. Not one item. Not for 40 years. That is the price of losing your grandparents. Now here's the part nobody expects. Old age is not natural. For almost the entire history of our species, barely anyone got old at all. Then, around 30,000 years ago, that flips. Suddenly, grandparents are everywhere. And at that exact moment, humans start doing things they had never done before. Painting on cave walls, sewing fitted clothing with real needles, carving instruments, making jewelry, burying their dead with gifts. After 300,000 years of almost nothing changing, nobody got smarter, brains hadn't grown. 2 or 3 people around each fire simply started living long enough to talk. That is the reason you exist. And underneath all of it sits one question. The single question that decided whether a family lived or died. When do you move? Stay too long and the food runs out. Move too early and you burn calories for nothing. Move in the wrong direction and everybody dies. Hold on to that question. It's going to follow you for the next half hour. First, forget the line about nobody living past 30. That number is an average, dragged down by dead infants. Survived childhood back then, and 60 was normal. 70 happened. So old age existed. It just wasn't common. And we know exactly how uncommon because of something almost stupidly simple. Teeth. Teeth wear down as you use them, like tread on a tire. A 20-year-old's mouth looks nothing like a 60-year-old's. So you can walk into a burial site, look in the mouths, and sort the dead into young and old. Researchers did that across thousands of skeletons, spanning millions of years of human evolution, and they asked one question. For every young adult here, how many old ones are there? The answer, over and over, was brutal. Almost none. Getting old wasn't a stage of life, it was luck. And then luck stops being the explanation. Around 30,000 years ago, the count flips. Old people don't just become more common, they multiply. In some groups, they start to outnumber the young adults. For the first time ever, grandparents are normal, not lucky, normal. Same brains, same bodies, same landscape. And the archaeology explodes. Needles, barbed harpoons, spear throwers, ivory carvings, goods carried hundreds of miles to trade. The only thing that changed was that people started sticking around long enough to teach. If that just landed for you, hit subscribe now, because the rest of this is about what those old people actually knew and why losing one could kill a whole family. So what did they know? Start with the obvious answer, because the obvious answer is wrong. You'd think elders were valuable for everyday knowledge, which plants are food, where the water is, how to knap a blade. But everyday knowledge isn't rare. A 30-year-old hunter knows the everyday stuff. He's done it 10,000 times. The value of an elder was never the ordinary. It was the rare. Think about what a life actually contains. In 70 years, how many true catastrophes do you live through? The once-in-a-generation drought, the winter so cold the herds never came, the river that changed course, the sickness that swept the valley. These events are separated by decades, which means the only person in camp who has seen one before is old. And when one of them hits, the group has to answer that question. When do you move? There's a species that shows this with brutal clarity: elephants. In 1993, a severe drought hit Amboseli in Kenya. Some elephant families stayed put and starved. Others left the park entirely and walked to water. Researchers looked at which families left. The families that left were the ones led by the oldest matriarchs, old enough to have lived through the last catastrophic drought decades earlier. They remembered where the water was when everything else dried up. Calf survival in those families was dramatically higher. The young matriarchs didn't leave, not because they were weak, because they didn't know there was anywhere to go. They had never needed to know, and their calves died. The old ones weren't stronger. They just had a bigger sample of bad years. Now, here's a myth worth killing. People assume ancient tribes kept elders around out of sentiment, affection, family loyalty, basic decency. That may be true, but it is not why it worked. An old person costs calories. They eat every day and they slow the group down. Over thousands of generations, a group carrying a useless burden loses to a group that isn't. So the fact that humans kept their elders and then evolved to produce more of them tells you something cold. They were paying for themselves. The evolution of grandparents wasn't a moral achievement. It was an economic one. And the economics get strange when you look at our bodies. Humans live for decades after we stop being physically impressive. That should not happen. Look at our closest relatives. A chimpanzee peaks in its 20s and rarely sees 50. Strength fades, and the animal dies not long after. Humans do something completely different. We lose speed in our 30s, strength in our 40s, and then we keep going for another 30 or 40 years. Both sexes do it. Evolution does not pay for decades of life after your body peaks. It has no reason to, unless those decades are producing something. So what does an old person actually do to earn their food? The first answer came out of Tanzania, and it wasn't the one anyone expected. An anthropologist named Kristen Hawkes went to live with the Hadza, one of the last true hunter-gatherer peoples on Earth. She went to study the hunters. She ended up staring at the old women. They weren't resting. They were out in the sun for hours, driving a sharpened stick into rock-hard ground to pull up deep tubers. It's punishing work. It takes strength, technique, and patience. She timed them. The old women were working longer days than almost anyone in camp. Then she followed the food. They were barely eating it. They were handing it to their grandchildren. And when a grandmother was in camp and working, those children gained weight. Then came the detail that mattered. When a mother has a new baby, the older child's nutrition should collapse. Mothers can't forage as hard with a newborn. With a grandmother in camp, that collapse didn't happen. The grandmother absorbed the gap, which meant something enormous. Mothers could have the next child sooner and still keep the last one alive. A chimp mother waits about 5 years between births. A foraging human mother often manages 3. 2 years multiplied across a lifetime is a different species. For a while, that looked like the whole answer. It wasn't, because it only explains half the camp. What was the old man for? Whatever a grandmother gives you, you can weigh. Food in a hand going into a child. An old man's contribution doesn't arrive as an object. Which land your family is allowed to hunt. Which neighboring band owes you a favor and which one doesn't. Where the herds went in the bad year before you were born. You cannot put any of that on a scale. So for a long time, people assumed old men were dead weight. Then somebody counted the calories. Hillard Kaplan and his colleagues tracked food across hunter-gatherer tribes in South America and Africa. They asked one simple question about every person in camp. Do you produce more food than you eat or less? Children are deeply negative, obviously. Young men in their 20s are barely break even. They're strong, but they miss. Production climbs through the 30s and peaks somewhere in the 40s. And then, here's the part that surprised everyone. It stays high. Among the Aceh and the Hadza, men in their 50s and 60s were still net producers, still bringing in more than they consumed, decades after their bodies had declined. Old men were not a drain on the group. They were subsidizing it. Because we don't eat easy food, we eat food that has to be tracked, extracted, processed, or hunted. And that takes decades to learn. But food is only half of it, and it's the less interesting half. Because there's a second thing elders carried, and it can't be dug out of the ground. Information about events too rare to experience twice. Let me show you how deep this goes. Along the coast of Australia, Aboriginal communities tell stories about the sea. Stories about a time when the coastline sat further out, when you could walk to islands that are now offshore, when a place that is now open water was hunting ground. Geographers cataloged these accounts from over 20 separate coastal groups. Then they compared them to the actual sea level record. The sea rose after the last ice age. It stabilized roughly 7,000 years ago, which means any accurate memory of a lower coastline has to be older than that. 7,000 years. 250 generations of people passing a description of a shoreline down a chain of voices, with no writing. Not one link in that chain could break. That is what oral tradition is actually for. It isn't entertainment, it's a storage medium. And elders are the drives. Compressed experience, encoded so it survives the person who learned it. Which brings us to the obvious problem. A storage medium can be destroyed, and in a world without writing, there is no backup. If the 3 people who know where the emergency water is die in the same winter, that knowledge is gone. Not misplaced, gone. Forever. And the next drought hits a group that no longer has an answer to the question, when do you move? Which is exactly what happened in northern Greenland. Go back to the group I opened with, the Polar Inuit, living further north than almost anyone on Earth. Around the 1820s, disease swept through them, and it killed disproportionately among the older members of the community. Now look at what the survivors actually lost, because the list is worse than it sounds. They lost the kayak. Not the idea of a boat, the build, the frame, the joints, the skin, the waterproof seams, the balance. They lost the leister, the specialized fish spear. They lost the bow and arrow. They lost the heat-trapping design elements of their snow houses. These were not luxuries. These were the tools that made that coastline survivable at all. The knowledge had never been written anywhere. It lived in the hands and heads of specific people. Those people died, and the skills died with them. For roughly 40 years, that community lived a poorer, narrower, hungrier life. And they didn't reinvent any of it, not one item. That's the part people struggle with. We assume smart people can rebuild what they lost, but a kayak is not obvious. Every detail of it is the residue of hundreds of failed attempts by people long dead. You cannot rederive centuries of trial and error from first principles in a hard climate where a mistake kills you. The knowledge only came back in the 1860s. Another Inuit group migrated in from the west. They brought the kayak, the bow, the spear. The technology was reintroduced by contact, not by invention. That is what losing your elders looks like. It doesn't look like sadness. It looks like going backwards. And Greenland isn't the only case. Look at Tasmania. Around 12,000 years ago, rising seas cut Tasmania off from mainland Australia. A few thousand people were isolated, with no contact, for roughly 400 generations. Archaeologists tracked what happened to their toolkit over that time. It didn't grow, it shrank. Bone tools disappear from the record entirely. The problem was never intelligence. The problem was how many teachers you have. With fewer people, you have fewer experts in any given skill. And every generation, a little transmission fails. Skills don't vanish in a dramatic moment. They erode, one slightly worse copy at a time, until nobody remembers there was a better version. So how did ancient humans protect against this? They built redundancy into everything. And once you know what to look for, you see it everywhere. First, they distributed the library. No single elder knew everything. Different people held different domains: plants, weather, animal behavior, ritual, genealogy, territory boundaries. If one person died, the whole library didn't burn. Second, they made forgetting physically difficult. Rhythm, song, rhyme, dance, ritual. Every one of those is a memory technology. You cannot casually corrupt a song that everyone in camp has heard 400 times, told in the same season, with the same words every single year. And third, the clever one. They mapped the knowledge onto the land itself. In many hunter-gatherer tribes, information is attached to places. That rock is where a specific event happened. That bend in the river is where a specific rule applies. The land becomes an index. Walk the route, and the route reminds you of the story. You aren't relying on abstract memory. You're relying on the world to prompt you, which is why displacement destroys oral cultures. Move people off their land, and you don't just take the land. You take the filing system. The stories still exist, but the triggers are gone. Within 2 generations, the detail bleeds out. Now flip everything I've said so far, because there's an assumption buried in it, that elders were passive, repositories, storage. That's wrong too. Tribal elders were decision makers, and the decision was almost always the same one: when to move. Almost every catastrophic failure in a foraging life comes down to timing. Deciding correctly requires knowing what a landscape looks like in a bad year, not a normal one. Only an old person has that comparison set. So the elder wasn't the archive. The elder was the forecast. And a forecast is worth feeding, which is why the hardest skills in that world were never physical. Take tracking. Louis Liebenberg spent years in the Kalahari with hunter-gatherer trackers. He documented what expert tracking actually involves, not following footprints. Anyone can follow footprints. Reading the depth of a hoofmark to judge how tired the animal is. Knowing from the spacing whether it's walking, alarmed, or wounded. Predicting where it will go based on wind, heat, and what it ate yesterday. The master trackers were almost always the older men. Same pattern out at sea. Traditional Pacific navigators memorized star paths, swell patterns, and bird behavior across thousands of miles of open ocean. That training took a lifetime. So the navigator was old, and the crew were young. The crew supplied the muscle. The old man supplied the map. And there's one more job that fell almost entirely to elders. The one we underrate most: diplomacy. A foraging band is small, maybe 20 or 30 people. 20 people cannot survive a bad decade alone. So when the answer to when do you move is now, the next question is where? And the answer is always onto somebody else's land. Which means you need relationships with the bands around you, rights to cross, permission to use their water, marriage partners, refuge when your area fails. Among the Jew/Hawansi, this ran through a formal exchange system. Partners across enormous distances, traded with for years, sometimes for a lifetime. That network takes a lifetime to build. A young man has no partners. An old man has 40 years of them. And an old woman holds the entire kinship map in her head. Who is related to whom? Which marriage repaired which feud? Between them, the elders were the foreign policy of the whole group. Which brings us somewhere uncomfortable. If elders were this valuable, why do we find evidence that some groups abandoned them? Because they did, occasionally, in extreme conditions. Ethnographers recorded it in the harshest environments on Earth. When starvation was absolute, when the group physically could not carry someone, hard choices got made. But here's the pattern, and it matters. These were not routine practices. They were crisis behavior in the most marginal habitats humans ever occupied. Everywhere with even modest resources, it flips completely. Elders are fed. Elders are carried. Elders are protected. Which tells you the default setting was care. Abandonment was the exception, and it was a symptom of catastrophe. And we can prove the care because bones remember. In a cave in Iraq called Shanidar, archaeologists found a Neanderthal man. He had suffered a crushing injury to the left side of his face. He was almost certainly blind in one eye. His right arm was withered and lost above the elbow. He had damage to his leg and foot that would have made walking difficult and painful. And every single one of those injuries shows healing. Bone grows back, slowly, which means he lived for years after being maimed. A one-armed, half-blind, limping man in an Ice Age landscape does not feed himself. Somebody fed him. For years. There's another one from France, an older Neanderthal with severe arthritis in his spine, hip, and jaw. He had lost most of his teeth long before death. The sockets had reabsorbed, which takes years. He could not have chewed tough meat. So someone was preparing food he could actually eat, softening it, cooking it down. That's not sentiment. That's daily labor for years for a man who could not hunt. Now ask why a group under enormous survival pressure would do that. You don't invest that much in someone unless they're returning something. He couldn't return muscle, so he returned the only other thing a human can return, what he knew. And this goes back further than Neanderthals, much further. At a site called Dmanisi in the country of Georgia, researchers found a skull. It belonged to an early human who lived roughly 1.8 million years ago. The skull is almost entirely toothless. Nearly every tooth had been lost long before death, and the bone had healed over the sockets. That healing takes years. In a world with no cooking pots and no soft food, a toothless individual should die quickly. This one didn't, which means 1.8 million years ago, somebody was helping. That is one of the oldest hints of compassion in the entire fossil record. And it tells you this instinct isn't new. It's older than our species. Here's the mechanism underneath all of it. No single person invents a bow, or a snare, or a fish weir, or a birch bark container. Each one is a stack of small improvements made by different people across many lifetimes. Receive 95% of the stack and it shrinks. Receive all of it and add a little and it climbs. Elders are the step where it either transfers or it doesn't, which finally answers the loop from the start. Why 30,000 years ago? It's a loop, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. A few more people survive to 50. Better shelter, better clothing, food that keeps through a winter. Those people teach. What they teach makes survival easier. Easier survival means more people reach 50, more teachers, less lost between generations. Longevity building culture, culture building longevity, each turn throwing the next one faster. That loop is the engine of everything you have ever touched. Agriculture sits on it. Writing sits on it. The screen in your hand sits on it. It started at a fire because two people who couldn't run got to stay. And we did eventually solve the storage problem. Writing, printing, hard drives. Knowledge stopped dying when a person died. So by the old logic, elders should be obsolete. You don't need your grandmother to tell you where the water is. You have a map in your pocket. But look closely at what actually got stored. We stored facts brilliantly. We stored judgment almost not at all. How to hold a family together through a bad decade. How to know when to leave and when to endure. What a crisis feels like from the inside. And how it ends. None of that digitized well. It's still stored the old way, in people who are running out of time. So go back to that fire, 30,000 years ago. The two people who couldn't run. Picture what they actually were to that band. She was the drought map and the medicine cabinet. She was the reason the children ate in a bad month. She was the kinship record for 4 generations in every direction. He was the tracking manual and the territory map. He was the treaty with the band over the ridge. He was the one who taught a 14-year-old how to read a hoof print in wet ground. Between them, they held every mistake their people had made in 70 years, and every recovery from it. Between them, they were the only ones who could answer the question, when do you move? If they died, that band didn't lose 2 people. They lost the last copy. That's why they were carried. Not because anyone was being kind, though they may have been. Because they were the difference between a family that survived the next disaster and one that didn't. didn't. And here's the last thing. Every one of us is descended from a line that got this right. Every single ancestor you have, going back 300,000 years, was in a group that kept its old people alive long enough to teach. The ones who didn't aren't your ancestors. Their lines ended. You are the output of an unbroken chain of transmission. Hundreds of thousands of years of somebody older sitting down with somebody younger and saying, listen, this is what happened last time. That chain runs all the way to you, and it is still running. Somebody in your family is currently the last copy of something, a story, a recipe, a reason, a name. Nobody has written it down. If you want to see what else those ancient tribes understood that we've forgotten, watch the video on your screen right now. Because the fire wasn't just for warmth.